Well, hi everyone. I am so glad that you are joining us today. And I wanted to talk about the topic where when we want to try new things, our brains like to go into overdrive and start really messing with us and telling us how things aren't going to work out and you shouldn't try that anyway and people aren't going to like you. And I know almost every year when school's going to start, kids get excited about it. They get excited about telling that special person that they like them. They get excited about all the new clubs and all the stuff that they can do, even like this new semester that we just started. But then our brain comes in, kind of ruins it for us and tells us that it's never going to work out and we shouldn't do things. So I have a guest with us today, Emily Drake, and I'm going to let her do most of the introducing of herself, but she is going to be able to help us with this problem where our brains like to put negativity in the way of all the fun things that we want to do. So, Emily, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, Cynthia, I'm so happy to be here. I listened to a couple episodes of your podcast and I learned a lot.
Oh, good.
So, yes, for teens, absolutely. If you're listening, we love you. We're glad you're here. But for
Hmm.
the other Emily Drakes in the world, this is worth a listen to. I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm delighted to do my own introduction. I am a mental health clinician. And I am also someone who went to college to be a veterinarian. So there you go. If you're considering what's next for you, the short answer is I don't know. So this whole part about trying new things, like let's get good at it because it's
Hmm.
at least in my life experience, it's a good skill to build. But yeah, I switched careers in my 30s to be a mental health clinician. My clinical work was with youth in the foster care system,
Mm.
as well as 17 to 24-year-olds who were, graduating high school and looking for career opportunities, mostly from backgrounds that have many levels of oppression to them.
Mm.
And so, I am since then, and this was in the early, well, mid 2000s, I love teens. And
Me
so
too.
now I work in the C-suite. So there you go. And I run a company called the Collective Academy. We've been in business for 10 years. I am very proud to be veteran founded and women owned.
Mm.
I'm very proud to understand financial statements and P&Ls and take care of myself. I'm also partnered, but that was pretty audacious at the
Hmm.
time. As was this idea that the Collective Academy does is have conversations about career, what's working, what isn't, how's our identity doing as it relates
Mm.
to work? And are you feeling whole? Are you feeling like yourself? Or
Mm.
have you started to become a version of yourself that you're not really connected to? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of mental health components to that. And then also, Cynthia, I host a podcast called Who's Missing? Like you, I love podcasting. We are starting our fourth season
Hmm.
shortly. And the whole premise is to introduce people to individuals that are missing from their friend group, their dining room table, their boardroom table, people that have true lessons on life and leadership that don't often get the mic, or if they get the mic, it's to talk about what they're really good at and smart at, and not necessarily maybe the issues that connect us all, the human issues. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here. That's
I
my
love
jam.
that. That's
Hmm.
wonderful. Well, you
Hmm.
probably then, especially talking about career development and career change, you're probably seeing a lot of anxiety with people because anytime we're doing something new, like I said at the beginning, our brain is telling us, oh, don't do that, or that's going to be a disaster, or you don't know how to do that. So, who are you to try that new thing or whatever?
Hmm.
So, how do
Hmm.
you help your clients or the people that you work with that anxiety piece?
Yeah, the first step is always self leadership, I call it. So, understanding, and I'm sure, Cynthia, this is something you work with your clients and patients as well, understanding who you are, which, frankly, depending on any environment, doesn't necessarily change what you're great at. I had just for an example's sake, I was working with a prospective client last week, a kind of initial conversation, and she lives with ADHD and OCD.
Mm.
She currently works at a huge financial institution. She's young, I'd say she's in her mid 20s. And the first 20 minutes of our conversation, she spent saying what a challenging person she is,
Mm.
how difficult she can be, and all the things that make those diagnoses I just mentioned a real pain in the ass for other people, is what she
Right.
said.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about 10 minutes of listening to that. And then I said, can you tell me a little bit about your capabilities?
Mm-hmm.
So I bring that up to say, we are so wired, and we have report cards to thank for this,
Yes.
to look at where we're not great,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that we need to get better in those
Yeah.
things. And that's how we know. And so the way that I approach it is to really look at it from a self-leadership, strengths-based approach. That may be true that you got a D in geometry. It is also true that you are empathic and
Mm-hmm.
collaborative and are
Mm-hmm.
always leading team projects. What the hell is
Mm.
with that? You
Yeah.
know,
I love
can you
that.
handle both? So when I'm first working with people, I work on the things that are steadfast no matter where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're, president of the chess club or you're captain of the soccer team or whatever, what do you bring agnostic of
Mm-hmm.
the setting, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
as I just said about my own story,
Mm-hmm.
stuff can change all the time. So
Yes.
what's the steadfast stuff, right? And
Mm-hmm.
values is usually the conversation I center that around.
I love that. In
Yeah.
part of my program, I give the UMAP assessment, and I don't know if you know what
Okay.
that is.
I don't know it. I'm going to write it down though. I should know it.
And we do the Clifton strengths, so they
Oh
do the
yeah.
top five.
That one I know.
And
Okay.
then there's a values assessment as part of, so UMAP is four assessments. So it's the Clifton strengths, and then there's a values assessment in it. Then we use the Holland code for the interests or the personality.
Oh
Probably know
yeah.
about that. And then there's also a preferred skills versus burnout skills assessment. And so then we don't
Awesome.
spend a ton of time talking about career because we're talking about anxiety. But
Yeah.
if they know what their strengths are, then they can see how can I use my strengths to overcome anxiety? They can look
Mhm.
at their values, and the values is usually our why to get out of anxiety. If I have a value of adventure, but I'm staying in my room all the time because I'm too afraid to go to that next thing, then I can start looking at, well, I have a value of adventure. How can I use that value to get out of my room and get out of my door and go into these things that I want to do? And then we just look at all those pieces. So I love that you're saying that self-awareness is like the number one thing. I've had several guests on different times saying self-awareness, you gotta,
Yeah.
because since we're talking to teens, as adults, we realized we needed to be self aware, but we didn't do it when we were a teen. And so many times I think about
Mm.
what could I have done differently, or how could I have made my life even more amazing by knowing this when I was 15 years old? And
Mhm.
so I love that. Now, do you work with, just all ages? Do you have a lot of young people coming in? How,
Oh,
how
I
does that
wish.
work?
I
Is it more
wish. I'm a
like
little too
second career
expensive, I
people?
think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll say this. When I practiced clinically, I did. I miss it deeply. I think in my future, as part of my company's vision, we're merging with another business this year and really want to have an arm of our business that works with teenagers,
Yeah.
in particular in middle school, because I think that's, gosh, I mean, why not?
Yeah.
About all of these things.
Yeah.
So that is on my vision, in my vision. But right now, I wish I had more interaction with teenagers than I do. I will say I work with all of their parents. And I think a lot of the work that I do with their parents, I like to think trickles down. But I will say, my generation, so I identify as Gen X, just have a lot of preconceived notions about work
Yep.
and what work means and how long you should stay there. And so again, I
Mhm.
my expertise is in career in the area of work. Like, how does that prevent your kids or support your kids in
Mhm.
exploring who they are, you know?
Right.
And we had lunch with a friend the other day who has a 16-year-old. And she said, I myself am pretty new to parenting. I'm a stepmom, 2 years
Mhm.
in to a 9-year-old. And my friend's teenager, she said, one of the skills I've really learned is just saying, mm-hmm,
Yes.
hmm And not having, right, too much more to say about it
Yeah.
unless you want to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
But God, that must be really hard. So anyway, to answer that was a long answer to your question. I wish, and someday
Yeah.
more
Hmm.
teens. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Well, so
Thanks.
how do you help your clients get over some of that negativity that their brain tells them? Because like we said, changing the career can be really difficult.
Yeah,
And you may be excited about doing it, but then you just have all these doubts about it. So how do you help your
totally.
besides the self-awareness?
Yeah, so self-awareness number one. I mean, I think you sort of alluded to this, but small steps, I call them
Yeah.
micro movements.
Mhm.
I do this too because I too am a human being. And
Yes.
I like change if it benefits me. But the other change is a little scary. So at least if it doesn't have an immediate benefit. So learning to kind of develop the skill of novelty. Routines are very important, discipline's important, and consistency is important for all sorts of
Mhm.
stuff. But I don't know about you. My mental health was at its darkest when I was subscribing to a way of living that I hadn't ever taken a look at
Mhm.
from a place of like who I am. It was like
Yeah.
me adopting Cynthia's way of living
Yeah.
because Cynthia's got it together. So I'm going to go do what Cynthia does. And then
Yep.
lo and behold, 2 years into it, I'm in treatment for anxiety and depression because I
Yeah.
just was so overcome with anxiety.
Yeah.
So the way out of that is the way out of anything. The way toward who you really are is small steps. So I like to think about like, just today, I had a meeting with a friend and I was like, well, you and I talked about Netflix, but we said,
Mhm.
what are you watching on Netflix? I'm in the market. So I'm going to watch this show she recommended. And it's like, I've never seen it. It's definitely not something I would have chosen on my own or found on my
Mhm.
own, never heard of it. But even just taking in content that isn't something you would normally take in, or walking to school a different way,
Yep.
or trying a new food. I mean, these are low stakes ways
Mhm.
to build the skill of like, I'll get through it,
Mhm.
when it's a bigger stake thing. And I know you talk a lot on this podcast about, practicing when things are kind of manageable for when things get really unmanageable.
Right.
Um, but that novelty introduced, so self-awareness and then introducing novelty, I think is great. And then I'll pause after this just to see what you have to say. But I think, taking those small steps, I think as I reflect on this now, the Netflix example is good, but it's a sedentary
Mhm.
experience. I'd love
Mhm.
to invite listeners to do something that moves you a bit, not even
Mhm.
like exercise per se, but like you actually have to stretch to interact, stretch to ask a question,
Mhm.
stretch to usually there'll be another person involved. That's when we get really clamped up.
Yeah.
But have a little movement in it too. So your body gets the
Mhm.
experience of like, ooh, this is novel. And maybe it is
Mhm.
working out. I don't know. But those are some
Yeah.
thoughts on what I would do after okay, know thyself. Now what? Because
Yes.
you can't know yourself by yourself in your room.
Right, right. And I think that sort of just the nature of being a teenager, for one, they like to be by themselves because
Yeah,
that
of
means they're not with
course.
their parents. And so,
Yeah.
they're like, that's kind of like where they live. And they can socialize on their phone, where in the Gen X generation, which I also identify as Gen X, if we were going to socialize with people, we had to go somewhere. We had to
hmm
call someone on the phone. We had to, and calling on the phone was not what we wanted to do. We wanted to physically be with the people because that's what you did.
Right.
And
Right.
so you had to drive somewhere or walk somewhere or, whatever to be with people. I had never thought about this before, but towards the end of my school counseling career, we had a lot of kids who did not want to get their driver's license. And I was like, what are you talking about? I could not wait
I've heard
to
of
get my
this. Yeah.
driver's license because it meant I could get with my friends. And they explained it to us and it made so much sense. They don't have to drive to see their friends. They can
hmm
see their friend on their phone and they can
hmm
stay in their room and they don't have to drive anywhere. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. Because in my mind, I'm looking at it from a 1986 perspective of I want my driver's license so I can go drive to be with my friend, like so I
Mm-hmm.
can go hang out with the people.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't need that. And so that's, what was the difference to me. So they still need the social interaction, but they don't have to drive to do it. So they don't need the driver's license anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, I just find that to be fascinating. But that's something that as a parent, because we are always going to be a generation away from where our kids are coming from, we do have
Mm-hmm.
to think about, okay, well, this meant this for me, but what does it mean for them? And,
Mm-hmm.
why might they be acting in a certain way or doing a certain thing that doesn't make sense to me? And a lot of that is just having open conversations with your kids and doing that kind of stuff, like listening, because sometimes some of the stuff they're telling us, I remember thinking, oh, that doesn't make any sense, or I don't agree with that, or that isn't
Yeah.
what I think, or whatever, but you don't wanna put the judgment into it because that will for sure shut them down. So you
Yeah.
have to be able to listen to how it's different, why it's different, and if you've always kind of nurtured open conversation, then when they become a teenager, it will be much easier to have those conversations. I mean, they're still gonna be more closed off. They're still
Mm-hmm.
gonna wanna be in their room more than they were before. They're still gonna, you know, fight against you because they have to become an individual person away from you. And when
Mm-hmm.
they're babies and toddlers and little ones, they are pretty enmeshed in who you are because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way it has to be. I mean, like you have to, their survival is on you. But
Mm-hmm.
when they become a teenager, they could be, I mean, they probably wouldn't do a very good job of it, but they could take care of themselves. And they have to have their own ideas and their own opinions, and I feel like a lot of times kids end up coming back to what you would want them to,
Mm-hmm.
possibly, but you have to let them explore, "What if I'm not like my mom?" Or, "What if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not like my dad?" And,
Mm-hmm.
"What does that mean for me?" And they have to explore that and get kind of that in their mind so that they can make those decisions about career and about
Mm-hmm.
all their life partners and all the things that they're gonna make decisions about. And if as adults we're pushing them in different directions, it gets really confusing for them. I had
Mm-hmm.
many students in my counseling office at school tell me either my parent says I have to go into medicine, or my parent says I have to
Mm-hmm.
be a lawyer, or I have to go to a certain school. Or one boy, he was really good in wrestling in high school, but he didn't want to do it in college. And
Mm-hmm.
his dad was saying, "You will wrestle in college." Now, I suppose that probably had something to do with scholarship money and things like that. And I totally get why parents want that because, college is expensive, but
Yeah.
making your child go into a sport they don't want to go into is not helpful to them.
Right.
And, maybe even school isn't what that child needs, but they need some other kind of training to do the things that they want to do. Do
Mm-hmm.
you also, this is kind of off the topic of what we were going to talk about,
Yeah.
but, since you do career stuff, are you seeing that, in the past, we used to just think college, 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 but there's so
Mm-hmm.
many ways to be trained to do things that will make you happy and make you money. Are you seeing kind of people changing that thought a little bit and not just thinking about a college degree, but thinking about other kinds of apprenticeships and trainings that they could do to get the jobs they want to do?
I am going to pause and kind of reflect. I had a couple responses to the question. I have a lot of reflections on what you said before. My response initially to the question was like, college isn't going anywhere,
Mhm.
right? So that, for better, for worse, that's like the system.
Yeah.
And the democracy of like options with schools, pathways to schools, gap years before school, volunteering in some capacity, working for a while,
Mhm.
I'm seeing.
Okay.
So I can't, I think, I'm not as well versed in sort of like the data with workplace trends and advanced degrees. But I know that there's a wariness, at least in the people that I work with who are paying for college, if they
Mhm.
can, of like, what is all this going for, or
Yeah.
going toward? So I think, and I like to think about systems when I think about the impact on young people's lives, it's like, it depends. So much depends. And I think
Hmm.
that's really cool because if you had asked me 10 years ago, like, what's the pathway? It would have been like, well, it's obvious what the pathway is.
Right.
Now, if a kid comes to you, a teen, and says, what's the pathway? You can be like, you got options. It
Yeah.
depends. And I think in that there's more tolerance for
Hmm.
the variance of option. I do think college is great,
Yeah. I'm glad I
but
went.
it's not the only like thank goodness there's more choices.
Yeah.
So, I have limited expertise beyond that, but that's what I'm
Hmm.
seeing in my world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. You said you
Mhm.
had thoughts on the other parts you're talking
Yes.
about. Tell me about that.
I did. I was thinking I just wanted to sort of, I said, and depending on how you edit this, maybe people won't hear it, but I did say you have to get out of your room, which felt, now that I'm hearing myself back, it's like that feels like a real Gen X thing to say. I think what I mean to just kind of like, you know, practice a couple things. One, self-awareness of how that might have sounded, but two, what to sort of get the opportunity to add more flavor to it. It's this idea of stretching, right? So beyond, there's not two types of people in the world, but for the sake of the next 5 seconds, I'm going to say there are. There's people who lead with no and people who lead with yes.
Hmm.
No, not as an absolute, but just as like, ooh, I don't know. And then
Hmm.
there's people who kind of lean toward it. And, the U map, I'm sure, has many different things you can pull on to suss that out.
Hmm.
But I think if you're leading with no on, like, for example, you're on FaceTime with your friend, what would it mean to meet up in person with your friend, right? Like, it's just an ask to say, if you're living in four walls, what would it look like to open a window in
Yeah.
one?
Yeah.
What would it look like to crack the door open? Maybe not that. What would it look
Hmm.
like to turn down the volume? Like, just to kind of, it's not so
Hmm.
much, right? Especially with being in lockdown, it does depend on place, but so much of what we've learned is that we can and frankly, Zoomers are teaching us like how to connect
Yeah.
virtually. I also want to invite teenagers, because I would say this to anyone, to look at, what adults in your life do you spend time with?
Hmm.
Are you willing to say, like, who's missing from my life? Like a really great adult that I can
Yeah.
have conversations with about the future of what I want to do. Or, maybe even someone who identifies as like the greatest generation, like learning
Yeah.
from everyone.
Hmm.
So I really would say to teens, as I would to adults, like, who's in your circle and who can help you stretch a little bit outside of that to introduce some novelty and to find
Hmm.
like what's really compelling you, not what's compulsory. You mentioned this too.
Hmm.
I'm doing it, I'm wrestling because I have to.
Hmm.
And
Right.
that's a very different energy than I feel compelled to. So in the corporate space, we talk a lot about it. May be great that your employees follow the rules, but how much are you going to get from them if they don't feel compelled, like really
Yeah.
to move towards something?
Hmm.
So, yeah, that also came up for me as I was listening to you. Some really good
Yeah.
observations you made.
Well, and I was thinking about when you're talking about doing something novel, that's like a whole, there's like a whole section of the anxiety program that I do where we talk about listen to music you wouldn't normally listen to.
Hmm.
And, watch, I tell them, watch a news channel that is the opposite of your view.
Yes, love
Just
it.
to, yeah, just to like, because it will kind of bring your vibration up into some of that anxiety. But like you said, low
Yes.
stakes. Like, so you can
Yes.
feel the feelings and you can, but you're at home, sitting by yourself or whatever. So it's not like, and then you can work on bringing that feeling back down and regulating it before you ever go out and have a real experience where you're getting dysregulated. And then what do you do about it? Because you're
Yeah.
practicing it. And I asked them to practice daily. And I said, one of them can be like, you can also practice regulating yourself if you're in a boring class, like you're like, this is the most boring thing. And instead of continuing to think about how boring it is, think about other things or start noticing the room, start noticing what a certain person is doing with, or, tapping or, you
Hmm.
know, pay attention to when the teacher says a certain word a bunch of times, or, like what you like, just bringing your attention to different things besides this is boring and I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Or, waiting in a long line, that's,
Mm.
you can get super annoyed by that, but like, what can you do during that time? And so I just give them like ideas of ways that they can practice regulating in low stakes situations. And I love that, that novel thing. Like one of the
Mm-hmm.
things was order food that you wouldn't normally eat. Now, the
Mm.
tricky part about that, because when I think about that, I'm like, oh, I don't want to spend a lot of money if I'm not going to like it. And so I don't know. That one is a little tricky. Maybe they could eat part of someone's food that like everyone orders what they want, but maybe try different foods of other people so that nothing really gets wasted or it's not too expensive, but that they're trying something different because that is something that sounds so weird, but I was so afraid to try new things like that, like just new food.
Oh, sure.
Forever, I just said I didn't like anything because I didn't want to try any of the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now at my age, I'm just now starting to learn to try things that I always said I hated because
Yes.
I like, well, I want to see, do I really not like it? Or did I just not like the way it looked? Or
Yeah.
what somebody told me about it or whatever. So I think that's so fun. And I've been thinking about doing things like that more, or just doing something like learning a new instrument or
Mm-hmm.
trying to learn a different language or just
Mm-hmm.
all those things where you're just kind of making your brain think differently. And, and I'm going to think more too about who's missing from my table or who's missing from my circle. I feel like I am very open with teenagers, but I don't have a lot of teenagers in my life. Like my
Mm.
kids are adults and I'm a grandma, but they're babies. So, like I am kind of missing, but other than my clients, I'm,
Sure.
missing that teen element of people that I just hang out with or like that I'm, physically around. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to find some teenagers in my neighborhood to hang out with or go to the local coffee shop or something. But that would be fun because I love teenagers are my favorite age to work with.
Mm-hmm.
It always was in all the years
Mm-hmm.
that I was in education. And the little ones are cute, but I don't get as much out of the relationship there that I
Mm.
do with teenagers. And so I
Yeah.
I think that's great even for myself to cultivate some in-person real live teen
Mm-hmm.
relationships because I do think I live with my mother-in-law, so I have the greatest
Mm.
generation in my
Yeah.
home along and
Yeah.
it's so funny, my husband is a baby boomer
Uh-huh.
because he's right at the very end of baby boomer and I'm at the very beginning of Gen X.
Yeah.
So, and then we have millennials in our family and probably Gen Z too, because
Mm-hmm.
those can be early 20s. And yeah, so and then we have these babies, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking they're alpha, I think if I'm right, like the
Mm.
ones
Right.
that are
Yes. Uh-huh.
just being born. So we have
Yeah.
all sorts of people in our family, but I just don't have that teenage element. So I'm going to really look into that. But Emily, do you
Beautiful.
have anything that you want to share with my audience before you
Well,
go?
yeah. If you're listening and you like what Cynthia and I have to say and you don't know who's missing, you can certainly listen to our podcast. I mean, I feel like that's part of what I hope people do is listen and then reach out to the person who's being interviewed and like have
Hmm.
a conversation. I
Yes.
realize for some people that's like nails on a chalkboard, like cannot imagine reaching out. I do want to say one more thing with trying new things, especially as it relates to talking to new people because I think that's where I see with adults and with teens the greatest anxiety
Mm.
is rejection.
Yep.
That, if I ask for help or ask for something, that people won't be there for me. And I say this to my corporate clients and I say this to myself 9 times out of 10, people really do want to connect with you
Yes.
and help you.
Hmm.
And I had a number of calls today in my life. There was one where the person was like, "Why are we doing this? I don't have time for this," which is very rare and told
Hmm.
me a lot about what I took it as like, okay, you needed an agenda. I
Hmm.
don't need an agenda, but
Right.
okay, that's good to know. We should have that just in case for this type of meeting. And otherwise, it was just like take the pressure off,
Hmm.
and people want to connect and want to help. So that's just how we're wired, you know? As much as
Yeah.
we're wired for negativity and the negativity bias, we're
Hmm.
also wired to connect. So we got to somehow gotta make these two work together, you know?
Yes. I
Yeah.
used to tell kids
So
that about teachers at school.
yeah,
Your
yeah.
teacher, most people, and I realize there are a few exceptions to this, but most people become educators because they care about kids and they want
Mhm.
you to have a successful time at school. And if
Right.
you're not doing well, they want to help you.
Yeah.
And even if you happen to come across that one or two that are not in it for the right reasons, there are many adults in the building you can go to, and you're going to find somebody who does want to help you. And
Hmm.
so, don't stop at that one that maybe isn't in it for the right reason or is rude or, whatever, or you just don't click with. There is someone else.
Yeah.
And I hope all the kids I told this to, I hope they're still out there trying to find the person if they need to, but there's always going to be a person that you can connect to and that's going to be able to help you. And you just have to look for them. But there's way more of the good people wanting to help you than there's
Correct.
ever any of the other. And so you just have to be willing to have someone who's a little bit like, why are you talking to me about it? Or, how can I
Yeah.
help? But somebody will be able to.
I know we're almost at time. I just want to say this one last thing. I hear a lot. People are like, well, I just assumed you're too busy,
Mm,
right? You don't have enough time. You're already helping so many people. What's like one more is too many. Let me make
mhm,
that decision,
right.
right? So
Mhm.
this is a lot of teenagers thank God, are talking about boundaries now. We're all
Yes.
talking about boundaries.
Oh, I'm so glad
If
too.
you cross a boundary of mine, I'll let you know. But you
Mhm.
don't have to take care of me, right?
Right.
I'll let you know if I don't
Yeah.
have time or if I can't. But assume people want to help and assume people, if they can't, will tell you and will help you find another way,
Yeah.
right? So I think that takes some of the pressure off too. That's my responsibility to let you know, not
Yeah.
yours.
I
Yeah.
love that too
Yeah.
because of the mindsets that cause anxiety for me, over responsibility is the one that
Oh,
causes the
yeah.
most anxiety for me because I do believe that if someone doesn't like something or someone is upset, somehow it's my fault. Somehow I've
Yeah.
caused it.
Yeah.
Somehow, I should have done something different. And I love all the boundary talk and all that space.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I needed that so bad. I needed someone to tell me it's not my responsibility to make people happy.
Right.
And that was really hard for me to learn way late in life. And
Mhm.
I probably had some abusive relationships because
Sure.
I just thought I needed to be the perfect whatever and just do whatever somebody said so they would be happy.
Hmm.
And that is that was I'm glad I'm not doing that anymore. It took a long
Yeah.
time to get to that point, so I'm glad that
Yeah.
you are helping with that message as well. Well, I'm
Yeah.
so glad that you joined us today. It has been so fun, and I want everyone to just check out I'll have all of your social media stuff in my show
Great.
notes, and they can go and see your podcast and all the work that you're doing and connect
Great.
with you, and maybe ask you some questions or whatever it is that
Please
you
do.
need. I know, I love that, and that'll put some more people in your world.
I love it. Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you too.